Okay, let's start then.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brady Lund.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Beckstrom.
And today we'll be talking a little bit about the dark web and libraries, subtitled Preserving Patron Anonymity on the Web. This is something that Matt and I have been exploring, researching, writing about for about 3 years now, I think.
Several years, yeah.
So I first discussed it at the 2017 ALA conference. And at that point, that was our first meeting in a way. Matt was in the audience, but we didn't actually talk to each other at that point. But then we connected pretty soon after that, and have been working with each other ever since on these kind of like internet online privacy kinds of topics. And just recently, early September, we had our first book on the dark web published. And so we're going to be talking a little bit on the topic of that. And this is loosely structured based off the presentation we did at ALA this past summer, but we'll have some more time to discuss certain topics, go into a little bit more detail, and maybe be a little bit more relaxed in how we go into different things with this presentation.
And so if I may just introduce myself just briefly, because I don't go to Emporia, so I
Oh, yes.
Maybe someday I will. I'd like to, but my name is Matt Beckstrom. Like I said, I work at the Lewis and Clark Library in Helena, Montana. Yeah, like Brady mentioned, we both have had a long interest in the dark web. I'd written a book previous to Brady, which is not nearly as good. The book with Brady and I is way better. But on privacy in libraries mostly, and it kind of centered around a lot of different topics, but it also did talk about the dark web a little bit near the end. And so, yeah, when I went to ALA last year, I saw someone was doing a presentation on the dark web, so I went and saw it, and yeah, then Brady got a hold of me, and it's been all good things since then.
Yeah. I guess I should introduce myself because we have some people here who might not be current Emporia State students or alums. So I'll just briefly introduce myself as well. I forgot we removed that slide from here. My name is Brady Lund. I am a PhD student at Emporia State University. I got my master's degree here at Emporia State as well, and my bachelor's degree from Wichita State University. And I've been working here as a research assistant for several years, do all kinds of research, have been published in several journals. And this is one of my many interests, but a very big interest of mine, I would say. And I've really enjoyed working with Matt over the years that we were working on this project, and learned a lot from him in that process. So I'm excited to be here today talking about this.
And it works really well too, because yeah, I've been working in a public library for over 20 years and done a lot of stuff with dark web. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah. So just for full clarification, I got my master's degree from University of North Texas, which is not nearly as good of a school as Emporia. A couple of years ago, 2012. So yeah, Emporia would have been better, I'm sure. So anyway, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to cover this evening. So in the overview, we're going to touch briefly on what basic understanding of what the dark web is. I'd like to talk a little bit about the internet and the history of the internet. We're not going to spend too much time in the history of the internet, but we do think it's important for you to understand how the internet kind of came about and how it got to where it is now, and what the deficiencies were, how the internet evolved in ways that were not thought of for privacy or security. And that'll kind of lead nicely into a discussion about the dark web and how it came about, and how some of those dark web tools were kind of designed to solve some of those problems we've seen with the regular internet. We'll talk a bit about the brief history of the internet and of the dark web. Then we'll spend a little time talking about how the dark web works. We're not going to go too technical here. I think that the main point here is to get you to understand how the different tools in the dark web work, and how they work on the internet, and how they interoperate with the internet to solve certain solutions. Then we'll talk about 3 of the major platforms that are used on the internet. There's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of platforms that can be used on the dark web. But we'll talk about 3 of the big ones that are used most commonly. We'll also talk about some popular dark websites. Excuse me. We'll probably not do any demo, I don't think, but we'll talk about some of the sites that are available on the internet, on the dark web, and how they're accessed. Then we want to spend a lot of time talking a little bit more about how the dark web is used in libraries, how it can be used. We'd like to dispel some myths about the dark web, and also cover some of the different types of news articles that are going on around the dark web. All right, Brady?
All right. So I put these headlines that I clipped from various news sources, prominent news sources, just to kind of set the stage for why we thought this topic was important. And I remember what initially got me interested in this subject was my first year here at Emporia State. I was looking to purchase a car, and I went to various websites looking for information and for a car that would suit my needs and my budget. And then I would go to other sites like CNN.com, and all of a sudden I would see these ads that were tailored specifically for what I was looking for, for the websites that I had just visited. And I started to wonder why, or how do these websites know where I've been before? How are they able to track that information? And what other information might they have about me? And what can they do with that information? And so through that, I started to learn about cookies and how these data packages are collected by websites and follow you as you navigate throughout the web, and how this data kind of sets a trail in an identity for who you are on the web that is available to these websites you visit. And then I started to think about, well, how can we kind of circumvent, or is there any way to stop the collection of cookies if we are not interested in having them? Is there any way to stop this data collection in general, that everywhere you visit on the web, there is this information collected about you, either with your permission, but you don't really read those warnings in detail about what all information they're collecting, or information that's collected without your knowledge. And that's where I first began to investigate the dark web. And so these headlines are just from the last year, different concerns about web security and web privacy, and concerns like cookies, concerns about social media and major internet sites collecting information about you. They present a fairly gloomy picture of the state of the internet and internet privacy, especially in the United States. Between the escalation of internet surveillance and the decline of net neutrality, there is very little to protect your data from being collected and used without your knowledge or consent. Now, I don't think we would argue that the dark web is a fix-all by any means, but it does certainly offer a certain layer of security and privacy that you're not going to get with your traditional web browsers. Especially with Google Chrome and Internet Explorer, Google Chrome has a lot of challenges and vulnerabilities. Firefox is a little bit better, and as you'll see or learn tonight, actually the most popular dark web platform, Tor, is created within a Firefox shell, so it's kind of the bones behind the most popular dark web platform, but there's still certain vulnerabilities that don't necessarily make it as secure and private as Tor itself.
And Brady, if I may, real quick, just while you give a bit of history, I can also just say a little bit. I don't want to say how old I am, but I've been doing this for long enough that my first couple of years of college was the time that the internet actually started to become a thing. That universities were connected, and I started seeing how this internet grew and it became this giant thing. And so I've kind of had this whole experience of watching it go from this truly like informational research kind of brief thing to where it is today, and then of course you look at all the stuff that's come out through the years, like you've got the headlines there for The Snowden revelations, when those came out, those were huge. You talk about different governments and around the world and stuff like that. It's been kind of an interesting journey watching the internet grow from where it was to what it is today. So it's, yeah. So I'm trying to switch my slides here. There we go. So let's talk about what is the dark web. The first thing is, is it some kind of evil dark alley on the internet, or is it a place where the evil things or dark deeds are performed, and is that the only place where you can only know the place where you buy internal organs or children or something like that? It is not all that, and that's not what it is. That's kind of what you're going to be heard from reading the news headlines. It is, though, a subset of the major internet. So like right here, it says the dark does not mean a place where illegal activities occur. It's called the same reason that the reason that the night is called dark. You cannot always see what is there. So that's why the term dark comes in. It's not that it's dark evil, but it's just where places where you can't always see.
Were you going to mention the alternative terms that?
Yeah, I'm going to do that right now. Getting ahead of me, Brady. One other thing too that we do want to stress is it's not always called the dark web. There are other names for it that are probably better and more descriptive terms. We've heard it called the hidden web, the anonymous web. There's other different names for it out there that are probably more descriptive of what it truly is besides dark. But I think we need to start with the typical, the obligatory iceberg analogy. So if you've got your giant iceberg floating in the ocean, you can see that down there at the bottom of the slide, the picture of the iceberg. Let's think of the iceberg as being the entire internet, which would be all the devices connected to it, all the wires and everything connected all to it. So that entire thing is the internet. If you were to take just that one little tiny piece of the top that's sticking above the water, what is it, 1/10 of the iceberg, that's what we would call the surface web, or we can also call the World Wide Web. But that's kind of where you would surf. You'd go to news sites. Do some research on various sites. Google's on there. That's where we spend most of our time, is up there on the surface web, or the web above the ice, the water line. Everything below that water line, the 90% of that iceberg, is what we're going to call the deep web. And the deep web is another term that's very specific to a part of the internet. Anything on the internet that is behind some form of a barrier, whether it's a paywall. So if it was like a subscription database you have to pay for, anything behind that paywall is part of the deep web. Netflix is part of the deep web. Anything you got to pay for, subscribe to, is part of the deep web. But it's deeper than that. It's also includes any kind of corporate resources. So you think about big companies that have all these machines on the internet, and they're storing their data on there, whether it's confidential data or just transactional data. Any kind of data like that that's not readily accessible to you on the internet is considered a part of the deep web. And it truly is, I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but it's the majority of the internet is what is deep. It's going to be truly 90 or more % of the internet. Of course, we don't know all that's part of the deep web because we can't see it, and Google can't access it, so we can't find out exactly how much of it's out there. So we kind of have to make guesstimates based on what the information we do have. Then you have at the very, very bottom down there, the very tip of that iceberg, you're going to have a little dark spot at the bottom there, which we're going to call the dark web. But for just the purpose of the rest of this presentation, we're going to always refer to it as the dark web. So if we say hidden web and anonymous web, that's what it is, but we'll try to say dark web. And that's where the dark web is going to be, is down at the very bottom. It's not accessible from the regular internet. I'm sorry, you can't just open up a browser and get to it. Whereas with the deep web, you could pay for that subscription, or you could get behind that paywall somehow, or subscribe to Netflix. You can get to the deep web from your normal web browser. To get to the dark web, you're going to have some kind of specialized entry method, whether it's a special tool or special application or some kind of special connection. So it's kind of that extra layer of access to it. And the analogy is kind of broken in the way that the dark web really is a part of the whole deep web. It's pretty much kind of almost think of like a spider web, kind of meandering around inside the deep web. So the dark web is kind of always there, just underneath the surface. We have a couple of examples there. Yeah, we have like the Emporia State Interlibrary Loan Program as a part of the Deep Web. And below that is a picture of the interface for the Tor, which is a browser that searches the dark web. So, am I missing anything?
I don't think so.
Cool, cool.
So now we will briefly discuss the history of the dark web. And when we discussed the history of the dark web in our book, we actually included quite a bit about the history of the internet. We thought that was important because the history of the dark web, we believe, is really intricately intertwined with the history of the internet, and really a whole history of information science and computer engineering dating back 100 years. I think, and we stated in the book, that it really started with like theoretical works by people like Alan Turing and Claude Shannon. But in a more practical sense, we're going to jump forward to like 1969, which is when the kind of predecessor of the internet, ARPANET, was first connected between UCLA and SRI International in San Francisco. And that was kind of the first line that was able to communicate data between these two areas. By 1971, just 2 years later, that had expanded to 15 sites, mostly at universities and research institutions across the United States. And it kind of formed that early internet connection that we hear about, the early internet really being used to connect universities and research institutions as a way to share data across these institutions. It continued to expand over the next 10 years until 1979, and then we start to see things start to transfer more towards the commercial market. And so the Internet Architecture Board was established in July 1979. In March 1985, the first .com domain name was registered, and shortly thereafter, America Online Services launched. And from that point on, we started to get a more commercialized side to the internet. Actually, 30 years ago this month, the first major commercial internet service provider was established. It's kind of crazy to think how much has changed in just 30 years when you think of historical epochs of change. So much has changed in just the last 30 years since the first major commercial internet service provider was established. Tim Berners-Lee, if you aren't familiar with who he is, you really should familiarize yourself with him. He is a monumental figure in the development of the internet, and also a very important figure in the field of library and information science, I would say, particularly information science. He basically made the World Wide Web possible. He developed the first web browser and the first website. And I've seen estimates that say if he had made the World Wide Web a for-profit venture, he could easily be the wealthiest person alive today, and no contest, perhaps the wealthiest person of all time. Because of the impact he alone has had on the development of essentially everything we do today. We started to see development of early search engines in the early 1990s, and these weren't very good search engines. They didn't cover as much of the web as certainly something like Google would today, but they were early efforts. Some of them were even kind of for-profit, or really tried to make a profit off of the search engine. Some focused on specific subjects. None of them were quite at the quality as those that would come later on in the next few years. And then we started to see in the early 90s a lot of websites that we are familiar with today starting to come online, not necessarily in the form that they're in now, because Amazon, for instance, started as an online bookseller, but this is when a lot of these sites started to emerge and begin to develop into these huge conglomerates there are today. And not too long after, we started to see the first of these dark web platforms. So Tor is the most popular dark web platform. We'll talk about that in the next slide, but it was not actually the first. The first was Freenet, then Tor, and then I2P, and those are the three we'll be discussing today. They all really started in the early 2000s as available to the public. Now, Tor was the first to be created in the sense that it existed somewhere in the world, but it was not the first to be released to public use. Tor was actually created in the 90s for use of government, of the United States government, as a kind of a forum for people, for instance, individuals residing in foreign countries, to securely communicate information back to the United States and to government officials without being caught, and those types of purposes. And really, that's another area that I've kind of taken interest in, is studying how intimately intertwined these different evolutions in information communications technologies are tied towards the United States government, and particularly military ventures. And so we saw it with early development of computer technology, early internet technology, and we certainly see it with early dark web technology. These were technologies that were designed for the benefit of the United States government, and for, in the large part, the military. And over time, they were released to the public and for more general use.
So, Brady, I just want to clarify a little bit more about the early internet, what was called ARPANET. You know, like you mentioned, it was designed, you know, and only a couple of machines were connected to it. But you know, the whole idea of the technology behind it was to make it quick and fast and simple. It was meant to be a fast communication device. And as it grew, and as they started putting more and more sites onto there, you know, once again, this is a closed network. There was no concern about security. There was no concerns about you know, who could access what information. It was meant to be open. It was meant to be as wide as possible. And then even then, when you got the universities start jumping on in the 70s, and you know, it wasn't a big issue, because there was only one or two computers at these sites that were connected, and they were only used for very specific purposes. You know, it was meant for a very purpose of sharing some kind of information or connecting with something. But as it grew, and as the ARPANET became something that was much larger than it was intended to be, you know, we start to see this move away from the idea of this small closed network to other organizations, other groups around the nation and around the world start creating their own mini networks, you know, their own you know, mini internets, if you will. And as they started creating those and seeing that technology grow with that, they started connecting them together. And then we got what's called the true internet. You know, you've got the true internet of networks connecting to networks, and then you start creating the backbones between them. But even then, I mean, so early, you know, they started thinking about tech security, but it wasn't the main focus and point at first. It was this idea of connecting with each other. And so you see how as the internet grew and as it became what it is today, or as it became to the point where it started getting more and more people connected to it, security was an afterthought. It wasn't their main primary focus. And by the time it was, it had started, they pushed the boulder down the hill, and it was rolling faster than they could catch up. And then you started seeing the explosive growth with private individuals joining America Online, like you mentioned. Then you get the businesses on there, and the technology starts to grow really, really fast. And people start to say, hey, I think we can use this to our advantage. I think we can find ways to make information better, faster, better, but also at the same time, we could maybe make a few bucks off of this. We could also find out stuff about that. And of course, worldwide, you look at the internet and how things happen in different countries, and governments have more control over what information enters their borders. And people still want that way to communicate. So that's where we got to where we are today. Mm-hmm. I should mention really quick, Brady, if anyone has any questions, I think there's a chat box, correct?
Yes.
I hope that if anybody feels like there's any need for questions, please chime in at any time, and if we see them, we'll try to answer all the questions we can.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
So like we mentioned before, there's different platforms. I mean, there literally are hundreds of different platforms that can access the dark web in their own way. Each one of them was designed to solve or to answer or to just solve a problem that someone perceived. If you think about some of the early file sharing applications, like LimeShare or oh geez, I can't remember the other ones. Those music sharing programs. Those are all part of the dark web, because you needed that client, you needed that application to connect to other machines on the surface web to communicate in a fashion that was hidden. So all those kinds of things are all different types of dark web platforms. Each one was created to solve a problem. So we're going to cover three of the big ones that are probably still used today. The first one we're going to cover is called Tor. Tor originally stands for the Onion Router, and that'll make more sense why it's called that, why it was called that a little bit. It is probably the most popular web browser or popular dark web platform, and it's the one that's probably the easiest to use, because like Brady had showed you earlier, it is based off of a Firefox shell. So it uses a open or source version of Firefox as its core. Tor also got a lot of press with the Snowden revelations. It's something that Snowden himself had used, and I think probably still does use for his own communication as a way to communicate.
And does advocate for it openly still.
Big time. I think he's on the board for Tor, actually. Mm-hmm. I'm not correct. I may not be correct in that, but I think he was. The other one we're going to talk about is the I2P, which stands for Invisible Internet Project. It is probably the second most popular platform. Tor was designed, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention this about Tor. Tor was really designed to get people around the internet and to solve the problem of hiding their communication. So if you wanted to access a surface web website, if you wanted to go to a website, but you didn't want them to know who you were or where you were coming from, you would use something like Tor. Tor devices can speak with each other, certainly on their own network, but Tor is really good at getting you access to information in a way that protects your privacy, protects your security, so they don't know who you are. I2P, the Invisible Internet Project, it's more limited in its capabilities. It is access through a normal web browser, but the I2P project was really designed to facilitate different forms of online communication, like blogging or chatting back and forth. Chat programs are a big thing. Some file sharing, but it was really designed to create a way for people to transfer information back and forth in a method that was secure, and wasn't always obvious who was sending it. And the last one we're going to go through is one called Freenet. It is also accessed via a separate browser. It's actually kind of a browser plugin. It's an add-on to your computer. Freenet is used for online communication as well. It's designed to work really well with file sharing, document sharing, and online communications like email and blogging. Same idea is the machines are on the Freenet, pretty much talk to each other. People transfer information back and forth on the Freenet network.
And so, oh, you got something?
I was just going to say that we do mention on there that I2P websites are called I2P. Their extension is .I2P, and I believe the short term for that is EAP sites.
Right. Yeah.
And Freenet sites are also called
So I was just going to point out kind of the reason why we've started to also embrace terminology other than dark web, like anonymous and hidden web, is because these platforms have gone away from using the term dark web themselves, or may never have used it in the first place, but it was placed upon them. But especially, we received some feedback during ALA about using the term dark web and kind of just how that's been tied to negative conceptions of what goes on these platforms. But particularly Tor, I found, really doesn't want to be associated with any of those terms particularly. They kind of want themselves to just be seen as another very secure browser, from what I've seen recently in kind of their promotions and like on Twitter and those kinds of things. They try to promote themselves as just a very secure browser, and you really could use it exactly in that way. As I say, you can access Surface websites. You can go to CNN.com from Tor, and it'll just give you that extra layer of security. So,
And the like yeah, Brady said that the big thing about these networks not wanting to use the word dark is because we'd mentioned earlier it's that connotation that dark implies something evil or illegal or bad, and so they want to avoid that. So, like I said, we don't want to spend a lot of time talking about excuse me, about how the dark web works. I think it's important for you to understand and get everyone to get a basic idea of the technology behind, but we're not going to go too deep into this. If you have more interest in this, there are some great resources on the internet. Each one of their sites, if you go to the Freenet site, has a great detail on how their network works. And it's kind of interesting to read how this things. But we're going to go through each one of them really quick. But we do want to stress, once again, like I said before, the darknet, these tools operate on the internet. They are not separate internets, and so they exist on the current internet. They just communicate in ways that are different from the other ones. So, on a general level, each one of these utilities operate in what's called like a node structure. Each computer that's on their different networks become like a node or a client on there, and then they transfer information amongst themselves, each one of them. Which is slightly different from the way the regular surface internet works. One of the big things about the way that almost all dark web clients work is that they deal with security and encryption. They've kind of been built up from the ground up with the idea of security in mind. Instead of starting out with this idea that everything's open, they start with the idea of everything's closed. And then you find ways to make sure it stays secure. So let's look at each one of them individually and see how they work. So let's start with I2P. So an I2P website, their clients, they use a tunnel technology. So you can see on the graphic here, on the left-hand side, you've got your starting peer device. So that's your device. When it connects to the network, it immediately starts broadcasting out, looking for other clients. And they transfer little bits and pieces of information back and forth about themselves, and they kind of know about their devices that are connected to them. And it slowly creates, actually this happens very quickly, it creates a random tunnel. So it creates a connection to one router, which connects to another router, which connects to another router. And eventually it gets to the point at the end where it gets to this last peer device. So along that way, as your information is going between your starting peer and your last peer on the network, each router along the way can add more encryption. It can also add more packages of messages. So you can have if you think of it in a way of a packet of information, and as it passes through this network, it's constantly being added to with other little bits and pieces of information, and each layer of security, they call this Garlic routing. So if you think of the idea of a garlic clove, and you have these little cloves that pop off the side, it's kind of the way that they've visualized this kind of communication going through. Along each step of this path is security. Everything's encrypted from the beginning to the end. So even if router B decides that they really want to capture this information and see what it is you're seeing, even they can't see it because it's been encrypted before by something else, and it's encrypted to be read only by the last peer on the network. So all along the way, everything's nice and secure. The next one is the Freenet. Freenet works a little bit differently, but you can still see you still have these different ideas of nodes or routers along the way. So if you have A connects to when a device connects to the Freenet network, it immediately starts broadcasting out and looking for nearby devices. And then when it connects to that device then hands it the information for another device. So device A doesn't necessarily even know that device D exists because C knows it exists. So it doesn't need to know all the devices. It just needs to know how to get to the next device on its path. So you kind of follow the mishmash of arrows here. You can see A sends to B, which sends to C. C sends back to B. B sends to D, who sends to E, F, and back to B. It kind of sends the information back and forth and around in the network, all along the way, picking up little bits and pieces of information and connecting to other devices. Once again, every step of the way, these are all encrypted. All these connections are added with layers of security along the way. Freenet, the thing that makes Freenet kind of unusual is that it uses a distributed storage technology. So if we think of a traditional website as, somewhere there's a server that has all this information on it. And when you connect to that website, you pull off all that information. Well, on a Freenet network, let's say you have an audio file. Let's say you have a song. When you put that file up on the Freenet network to store it, it's not stored on one device. It's actually taken apart in pieces and stored all over the network in different places. And then it's redundant. It's given duplicates of itself elsewhere. So bits and pieces of it exist in different places. And the beauty of that system is, even if that server goes down, let's say server B goes down, for whatever reason it gets disconnected from the network, all the devices will immediately just start rerouting all their communication around it. And since there's redundant pieces of storage of that same files that were stored on B elsewhere, the system can quickly recover and start pulling the data from elsewhere. Like I said, Freenet was designed to offer open communication. So the idea of if someone was posting information up on the Freenet network that someone didn't like, they can't take it down because it's stored in redundant places all over the place. And that's kind of why the Freenet network works so well the way it does. Bad thing is it is kind of slow. Mm-hmm. The last one is Tor. And like we mentioned before, the word Tor used to stand for the onion router. And so that's where we get the idea of this onion routing. So you have a user on the left-hand side there, and you have a server at the end. When your device connects to the Tor network, it does the same thing. It's kind of like the same idea as Freenet or I2P. It looks for other devices to connect to. But once it finds that connection, that device connects to other devices. So you have A, B, C, D, E, F, all the way through. And once again, everything's encrypted. So when the user sends his packet of information to node A, it's been encrypted already. A encrypts it again, sends it to B. B strips off a thing, puts on another layer of security, goes to C. So you can see this constant adding and subtracting of layers of security on the different nodes as they go through. And that's where you get this analogy of the onion. So it's like adding layers of an onion. That's where the onion routing comes from. The beauty of the Tor network is it happens fairly quickly. Then the system itself is self-correcting. If something goes down, it can redirect around it really easily. And Tor is really good about having these exit nodes. So if you look at node F on this diagram, that's what I would call an exit node. So my request is looking for an exit node to get off the internet, off the Tor network. When it gets to that exit node then makes the request to the surface web and says, hey, Matt wants CNN.com. So then it creates a connection from CNN back to F, then all the way back to the network, back to me. So the beauty of it is it's really, really hard to track what someone's doing because that piece of information is not going in a logical path back to the user. It's being bounced all over the internet. I always like this, this one back to the old movies of showing they show that world map on the screen, and they're like, we don't know where he's going, and they show the data bouncing back and forth, and that line that bounces back and forth. That's kind of exactly what the Tor network is and how it works. The Tor network was designed for accessing the surface web, but you can stay on the Tor network. There's a lot of sites that are only available on the Tor network itself.
And so how to access the dark web, it's actually not difficult really at all, especially if you're using Tor project or Tor. It's basically just go to this website and download it like you would download any browser. It's going to take you maybe 5 minutes and you can be up and running, and it really doesn't take anything special to activate it once you have downloaded it. You just use it like you would any normal browser for the most part, unless you're going to get into more advanced features to add extra layers of privacy and protection. If you're just using it normal, you just go right in and you can use it, and you'll still have that high level of anonymity and privacy. Pretty much the same thing with Freenet as well. You're going to download it, and then you'll be able to access the platform fairly straightforward just by entering the platform and just go at it. I2P has a bit of additional steps that you have to take once you download it. Once you install the content, you have to modify some of your network settings there is a step-by-step guide on how to do this on their website. We also discuss it in our book. But basically, you have to go into some of the privacy settings in whatever browser you're going to use and adjust some of those settings. It's not terribly difficult once you've figured out how to do it, but the first couple of times it can be difficult to figure out exactly where you're supposed to go to change all those settings. So I would always advise, if you haven't accessed any of these platforms before, Tor, I think, is really the way to go, especially if you're not necessarily needing it for privacy right this moment, but are more just interested in it or want to experiment. I think Tor is really the way to go for those kinds of users, because it is created within that Firefox shell. It has all the same kinds of functionality and familiar look as Firefox does. So it's not going to throw you off in that aspect or have a large learning curve. And then you can access those Surface websites. So you can use it just as you would any regular browser, but it also has the special sites that have the .onion suffix instead of like .org or .com. And those are sites that are specific to the Tor platform. So you can kind of get that Surface web experience still, but also get the experience of kind of what these platforms are.
The nice thing about them too, Brady, it also is that with the speed of the internet increasing nowadays, all that extra security slows things down. But nowadays, I mean, I use the Tor browser a lot, and it just feels like I'm browsing the regular internet because it's getting so fast.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so part of what we wanted to discuss with the book and some of the work we're doing now is kind of talking about the myths that are somewhat pervasive about what the dark web is, and kind of dispelling some of those myths, and also not, in some cases, not completely dispelling, but, you know, adding some context and saying, you know, this part is true, this part is false, and just really giving a more accurate assessment about some of these concepts about the dark web. And so I think the big one is, why would somebody who has nothing to hide use the dark web? And I think this is probably one of the most troubling ones, because if you believe that no upstanding citizen would use the dark web, then what follows is that the only people that use the dark web are people who are not upstanding citizens, someone who is doing something illegal. And so my kind of counter argument or description of that would be that the dark web offers privacy from those who track your online behavior without your permission. And I would say everyone should want that, regardless if you are engaging in something nefarious or you're just searching for some information you're interested in. If you're just engaging in normal information seeking behavior, scrolling through Google, I still would not want somebody tracking and collecting my information. So even as an upstanding citizen, as I would consider myself, I want that extra privacy. So I use the platform quite a bit myself as just my standard default web browser. Second statement is that it's illegal to use the dark web. So we have a caveat. We make this very clear in our book. We are not lawyers. We are not legal experts. So do your own research before you make any decisions on what you're going to do. However, in the United States, using the dark web for personal use at your home is not a crime. Now, what you access on there, if someone was to somehow track that to you, is still a crime. You know, if you're accessing illegal websites, that's still a crime. But just using like Tor to go to CNN.com, there is nothing illegal whatsoever about that. That's no different than using Firefox to access CNN. It's the specific website you access. And my argument is there's plenty of illegal content that you can access on the surface web still as well if you really look for it. So it's all about what you're looking for, not so much how you're accessing it. And finally, the idea that you need to buy something special or there's complex coding or some specific process that you have to go through to access the dark web, that's just not true. Tor makes it extremely, extremely easy. Like I said, it's a download. It takes 5 minutes. It's one of the things you just click through next, 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 and you'll be fine. It'll download the platform, and then you can use it like any web browser to search the web, basically. So this is just a small index of popular dark websites. We tried to compile a pretty extensive one in our book. There are some websites out there that contain quite a bit of information about popular dark websites. We also made a distinction in the book between these are the above the board sites. These are sites you can access that are perfectly legal and fine. And then we also feel like it was important to address some of the websites that have caused troubles in the past and that do have some illegal content, with a warning and a caveat that you yourself should probably not access this content. Just take our word for it, take our research for it. These are sites that you should steer clear from. And then there's some sites that are kind of in the gray area, and that's kind of where I put Sci-Hub and Library Genesis. I guess you can technically say the content on there is illegal because it breaches copyright. However, I don't know. I'm very conflicted about it as a librarian. I'm very conflicted about the idea that these sites are places where content from journal articles and manuscripts, books are taken and distributed for free. And from my perspective and in my experience working with individuals from developing countries, I can I just have very conflicted feelings about it, I'll say. However, there are several kind of mainstream surface websites that have also created dark websites. For what it's worth, these sites can still, if you log into your Facebook account, Facebook is going to have information about you. They just won't have information about where you went before you went to Facebook, for instance. And so Facebook's created their site. New York Times has a site. There's a Tor archive, which is similar to the Internet Archive for the surface web. So it kind of saves copies of various web pages at moments in time and collects that information to display. And then there's various forums. So every platform is going to have some kind of message system or forum where people kind of like just a blog space to talk about issues on the platform. And so they could be advocacy issues. They could be, hey, how do I do this kind of issues? And some of them could be morally questionable issues that probably shouldn't be on there. But for the most part, they are moderated. Most of the dark web platforms, especially Tor, do very well at self-policing. And so while they might not be tracking down and arresting people, they're pretty good at saying, we don't want this to stain the reputation of us, and so we're not going to support it. And so we're going to remove it from our forums if people are posting it and that kind of thing. I did want to talk a little bit about some of the illegal stuff, because I don't want it to ever seem that we're trying to whitewash the idea that there's illegal stuff going on the dark web. That's not the purpose of anything we're doing. There is illegal content on the dark web. There are people who use it for illegal purposes. We just think that that is actually a relatively small segment of what it is used for and what it can be used for. And there's a lot of potential that shouldn't be overlooked just because of some of the press from these negative events. And so really two of the biggest platforms that have gone through several iterations, been shut down, reopened, shut down, reopened over the years, are Silk Road and Pirate Bay. Pirate Bay is actually a site that you could access on the surface web for a long time. But a lot of people accessed it through the dark web nonetheless. And that's really just kind of your major torrent or distribution site for copyrighted content, videos, publications of all kinds. And it was subject to a major raid in 2015. And essentially, the way these raids kind of work is kind of old-fashioned detective style. It's kind of interesting. For instance, this other one, the Silk Road, which was kind of the big illegal eBay where illegal drugs and weapons were exchanged. The way they found this, the kind of owner of this site, was just going back through discussion boards, blog posts in the past where people were talking about developing stuff for the dark web, and found these posts by this individual who claimed to create this platform and had provided in their posts enough information to track down who they were. And based on that, they were able to identify this person and arrest him. And after that, were able to kind of track down and shut down a lot of the elements of this site. And like I said, it's come back in different iterations over time, but really never to the extent that it was in 2013 before the FBI shut it down. It really reached its peak over a period of only a handful of months, 4 or 5 months. It shot up in popularity very quickly, and then it was shut down by the FBI, and business shut down really quickly, diminished quite significantly. And so that's generally how it happens. I mean, they're out. The FBI is definitely out there. It's aware that this content exists on the dark web, and it's using methods to track these people down. It's just not, we're gonna necessarily hack into the site or something to find this information. To a large part, it's more traditional kind of detective. We're gonna search these boards, we're gonna find this information and piece it together to figure out who this was. So it's kind of interesting to read about. And in our book, I included this table because I just thought it was a fascinating way to visualize it. Because the Silk Road, that kind of illegal eBay, used Bitcoin for their transactions, I thought it was kind of interesting to put it in perspective of the value of the site in Bitcoins, and also to have that opportunity to talk about kind of the unstable value of Bitcoin over the history of the currency. And so cryptocurrency is very fascinating, but I personally would not recommend investing in it. It's somewhat unstable compared to virtually every currency in the world. And so it's kind of interesting how you can see kind of coinciding with the development of the Silk Road here in late 2013, that's when its value shot up significantly. And it was the primary currency on that site. And then when that site was shut down, it dropped. And then the craze kind of happened in 2017 and 2018 that probably most people can remember, where it got into the media about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. And the value shot up to $18,000 at the peak in 2017. And by the end of 2018, it was down to $3,500. And so if you invested in Bitcoin when it was first created, you were pretty darn wealthy at the end of 2017. But if you invested in 2017 when it was the peak of that craze, you've lost a lot of money over the last 2 years. Although I did check this afternoon, and the value is up to about $9,200. So it has risen back up a bit, but that's just, like I'm saying, that's very unstable currency. If it goes from 18,000 to 3,000 to 9,000, losing losing 70% of its value and then gaining that back over the course of 2 years. And then I felt like it was important to say the vast majority, I believe, of the illegal activity on the dark web is really copyright infringement. There is a lot of torrent sites of sharing of books and movies and television shows and that kind of content on dark websites, as there is on the surface web as well.
So the question then, can you use the dark web in libraries? And we include the disclaimer once again up here, we are not lawyers or the director of your library board or your library, so we can only speak broadly on this topic. In general, yes, you can use the dark web in libraries, and there are libraries that are doing it. It does get more complicated with E-rate funding.
But we talked to Alex Macrina from the Library Freedom Project, which is kind of a project that is being done by this former librarian who now works for the Tor project to help libraries set up basically Tor nodes and establish Tor services at their libraries. And she did say that it can give them some problems, but they've really, for the most part, not had too much difficulty.
Yeah.
Any library getting it set up.
And we'll talk a bit more here on the next slide, I think, about ways you can use it in the library. But for the big question here is, can you do it? Is it allowed? Technically, yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
So, how to use the dark web in libraries? And speaking from a public library where we do use the dark web, I can give you some examples of how you can do it. I want to say first thing too, there are two different ways to think about this topic. Topic number one would be that, to allow people to use a tool to access the dark web. That's one way. And that's, in my library, we have on our public computers, I have Google Chrome, and right next to it is Firefox, and right next to that is Tor. So if my patrons can come into my library, sit down at a public computer terminal, and access Tor to use this to access the surface web. I don't use I2P or Freenet at this point just because the technical issues around implementing those tools. So we don't do that right now. But the other side is, and Brady touched on it briefly, the last thing here is setting up your library to be a node on some of these networks. And that's the next step for me at my public library. We're working on a system right now to turn the public library into a Tor node. And this is a good thing because anybody can anybody can be a node on these networks. Anybody can set up a Tor node in their basement and have traffic passing through. And you can tune it. I mean, I wouldn't worry about turning on Tor networking in your library and having it just bring your internet to a crawl. You can tune how much data you want to be able to allow through the service. You can't control what it is. It's all encrypted. You can't see it anyway, so it doesn't matter. It's not like you're watching some kind of a terminal and you're seeing bad things go by or what people are talking about. It's all encrypted, so there's no concern about that. But it is a possibility that someone could say that by allowing the service to transfer over the library network, that you're allowing illegal activities to occur. And that's where it gets into the real legal stuff that you need to speak with a lawyer about, have your library talk with your powers that make those decisions for you before you think about doing this. And that's where we're at right now in discussions about this. There is also in public libraries, the opportunity for education. And I think that's a real aspect that I think is missing from a lot of implementations is the chance to go out and offer services to the public in the form of educating them on what the dark web is and how it works and how it can be used. Because once again, it's got that stigma in the media and in the movies that it's this horrible, evil, awful place where bad things are occurring and people are buying kidneys. It's not all about that. So it's our chance to go out and interface with people and say, no, this is not what it's for. This is a way for you to protect yourself. This is a way for you to to use the internet in a way that you can do research or chat with your friends or do whatever you want to in a way that's safe and secure. Brady, do you want to talk a little bit about academics?
I will say from personal experience, if you are working at an academic library, in an academic library, or you're a student in an academic library and you have it, you download it on your personal device or even on your the university device. Generally, for the most part, they don't care. And I have talked to some people about this. A couple different universities. For the most part, they it happens and they kind of just let it happen. And so I've used it myself. I have it on my work computer. Like I said, I like to use it as my primary browser most of the time. So generally, I think that it's kind of just, if you want to do it, do it. We're not really going to stop you or try too hard to stop you. Now, as far as nodes and stuff, I haven't done much research about academic libraries and whether that would be something that could be feasible. But
hey, Brady, we have a question here really quick. Someone asked the question, why these browsers can make the user anonymous, is the data that is transferred from the user to the server encrypted? Like saying if the user was using unsecure public network. And yes, it is. So, I mean, let's think about, you can actually get the Tor browser on your cell phone. So you can download the Tor browser on your cell phone. So if I were to go like into a public library and connect to the library's open, free public Wi-Fi, which at its very nature is insecure, but if I'm using, like the Tor browser on my phone, it's encrypted up my phone. And so it's sent to the wireless network encrypted. So you're safe. And that also brings up a good thing I forgot to mention a while ago too, especially when I travel. If I'm in a hotel, there are very few places in this world that are as horrible as hotel Wi-Fi. They're terrible places. They're insecure. They're old. They're aging. You don't know who's in the room next to you with some kind of a packet sniffer that could be looking for information. Hotel networks are terrible, and so I like to, if I can, I use either a VPN or I'll use something like Tor on my laptop in a hotel room, because once again, same idea. My laptop has the Tor browser in it. It's secure. It's encrypted. Even though I'm connected to a crappy Wi-Fi network, my communication is all encrypted.
They also have Tor for your phone now, so you can download.
But you said that.
Did you say that?
I did. That's all right, man. Go ahead.
I didn't know you said phone. I thought you said laptop.
I did say that's all right. Go ahead.
Apparently, I just spaced out for about 5 minutes. Okay.
Right.
But yeah, I use that all the time myself as well. Anytime I'm going anywhere, normally I just use it on my phone as my primary as well. Was there another question, or is that the one?
Someone was just asking about the Tor project website. Yeah.
Yep,
yes, that is the site.
Yep.
So, it's www.torproject.org is the website to download Tor. I want to point out one thing here too. School libraries becomes a much stickier situation. Schools rely heavily on grants and funding, and it's probably going to be a lot more difficult for them to use that. And there's also a lot of technology out there in some of these networks to try to find people that are using dark web tools and block them. So it's probably going to be more difficult in school libraries. But once again, we can't say for sure, so double check with your powers that make those decisions.
Okay, I did want to, the point of this webinar is not to sell our book, but I did want to include it in here just briefly, that we have a book and it has a lot more of this good stuff, and it's written pretty much the same way as we're talking to you, very conversational style, very kind of light, and we throw in some jokes and some humor, and it's I think a pretty quick read and fairly cheap for hardcover. It's $32. You can get 30% off with that discount code. So if you haven't gotten it yet,
And it's a gorgeous book. I don't know about you, Brady, but when I got my copy, I mean, the binding is beautiful. The pages are great. It's a good font choice. On top of the great information inside of it, it's a beautiful item. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah, so I think you can get it 22, shipping included, from the Roman website. And if you can get it to us, we are happy to sign it for you.
Just find Brady on campus. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So we're not going to read this whole huge thing, but basically I can explain what it says in short. And essentially the takeaway I wanted to have in the last chapter in the book was, I think there is a major need to kind of legitimize the dark web or the anonymous web as a secure platform that should just be used in average daily life and really just be ingrained in the fabric of our internet experience. And so I wanted to dig back, do a little historical research on kind of what people were talking about in terms of the internet, early commercial internet. And I found it I found this very fascinating article from 1996, kind of talking about the internet and how it was essentially a Wild West. In the terms they described it, very similar to how a lot of people view the dark web now. It was a platform that things like even the Smithsonian wouldn't create a website on the internet because they were afraid of copyright infringement and security risks. And how the way that kind of changed fairly rapidly in the mid 90s was really really fundamentally hinged on investment in the platform, not financial investment, but buy-in from individuals, buy-in from creators. People decided that this was a worthwhile platform and they started using it. And in doing that, they created motive for more people to create content for this platform, and vice versa. And that was really all it took to take this from kind of the Wild West, unruly kind of platform that didn't have a lot of focus or interest to the average person, at least, into something that became an integral part of what we interact with every day. With pretty much, in my experience, it's like an extra appendage. I use the internet constantly throughout the day. I just literally could not function without it. But just 23 years ago, less than I am years old, we'll say, it was not seen as that way. So it's quite a big change. And I have some optimism that if we can dispel some of these myths about the dark web and kind of portray what it actually promises, what it can promise to us as a secure and private platform, that we can turn it into a very respectable platform that would become an integral part of our daily life as well.
And that's where libraries come in, as just being this ability for us to be able to teach people and show them how it works and be that introduction into this world of an internet that can work for people in a way that, yeah.
And it's kind of a realization of what a lot of people in the early 90s thought the internet could be: a platform for the free exchange of information without this idea of really creating this curtailing this information specifically for people, and creating kind of these search bubbles where people get tied more and more into their ideology based on how the search engines collect this data and use it to curate the information that they can access. This is kind of a way, the dark web is kind of a way to circumvent all that and perhaps realize this true vision of the internet where people are freely accessing content and exploring content without outside control. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thanks from me and from Brady. It's been fun to do this. I look forward to hearing from anybody who has any questions after the fact. My email is mbeckstrom@lclibrary.org. My personal website is mattbeckstrom.com. And I don't mind if anybody has any questions or some more things they'd like to talk about. Please get a hold of me, get a hold of Brady. I think, certainly could do more if we do too in the future. But yeah,
Yes.
Thank you.
If you're at Emporia State and you want to come chat with me in person or anywhere close to here, I'm happy to do that. Or Zoom chat. We'll get you set up. If you're interested in having this happen for your library, we can probably do a little something to help you out, provide a little bit more extra advice as well. So, and this is a picture of my parents' cute puppy. Nice way to end off the presentation.
I'm actually surprised my kitten didn't come over here and make an appearance. He likes to jump on the table and be a pain. So, but no cat tonight. He decided to hide. So.
Yes, this will be available on the video.emporia.edu website. Right, Daniel? Yes. Okay.
All right. Well, thanks. I'm going to disconnect then. Brady and the gentleman over there who was helping Brady with the tech, thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll talk to you soon.